I'm going to stick with you, Brandis. More than 80 of the state's 102 sheriffs have refused to enforce this new law. Here is what Jeff Bullard, who's a sheriff of downstate Jefferson County, here's what he had to say on your show, Chicago Tonight.
We gave our feedback through the legislative process and knew that if it passed as it was written, that it would not be something that we would be willing to enforce, because our oath, first and foremost, is to uphold the state and national constitutions.
Now, Cook County Sheriff Tom Dart supports the ban, but sheriffs in counties near Chicago, so DuPage, Kane, DeKalb, McHenry, LaSalle, etc., they've also said they won't enforce the ban. So have we seen this kind of protest by sheriffs in other states that have enforced stricter gun laws? Brandis or Dave, if you want to weigh in.
Not to my knowledge. Or maybe we have. I honestly don't know, but I guess I kind of question, like, can you do that as a sheriff? Can you just pick the law that you choose not to enforce? I mean, obviously federal law would supersede state, but I mean, and Tom Dart has said, it is not our job to determine, the validity of this law. It's our job to enforce this law.
I mean, these sheriffs really ought to consider another job. I mean, and that is running for state legislator. Because if they think that, they get to pick and choose which laws that they should enforce, then they're in the wrong line of work. I mean, being a legislator is where these decisions get made, and that's the foundation of our democracy. And so that's the problem here. And I think, I remember a time when these gun control debates would come up. And typically you would see police groups who would be supportive of the gun control position because they didn't want to go into situations where, for example, they were going into a situation, a domestic abuse situation, and running into somebody who was better armed than they are. So it's a danger to the rank and file police officers on the street to have a lot of these high-powered weapons out there that can be used against them. Mm-hmm. And that's what's so curious about what these sheriffs are doing. There's a real political component to it as well. These sheriffs, for the most part, I mean, you mentioned the suburbs, of course, but for the most part, they're from downstate. Downstate, we know, is heavily red, heavily Republican. This plays well to the peanut gallery in their communities, and that's as simple as that. And it's not, I don't begrudge gun owners one bit, but it's a.
And is there anything the governor can do, though, to enforce this law?
Well, I think it's going to come out of the courts. I don't think a governor can go tell a sheriff necessarily. And what's one thing that's really sort of interesting to watch is the idea of discretion. And so that's where, you saw this with states' attorneys in the Safety Act, and now you're seeing it with sheriffs and the assault weapon ban. They're saying, it's my discretion, like this is my use of my resources. I'm not going to start going into people's houses and say, hey, do you have this gun registered? And that's where they're trying to draw this line. And that's it'd be interesting to see how it plays out. Of course, none of these laws are even in place right now, so it's all political pandering until, these laws are in place and we start to see what they actually do, because actions matter more than words. But that's where I find it the most interesting thing is the difference between discretion of what we're going to enforce, how we're going to, use our resources, and this law that to Dave's point, like personally disagree, they think violates the state and or federal constitution.
Brandis?
I was just going to say, what kind of precedent does it set that sheriffs can decide? And I hear John's point as well, and I can see them making that argument in court, and I'll be curious to see what a judge says about it. But what kind of precedent does it set that this is the one law that I'm just not going to enforce? And it may be something, maybe there's discretion about more obscure laws for stuff that almost never happens, or crimes that are almost never committed. I know that's kind of low level. I'm not going to go after it, but we are talking about real big guns, and in the wake of the Highland Park shooting. So it's not like they're opting out of something that is like small amounts of weed or something. It's much more significant than that.
Jordan on YouTube says, it is not up to sheriffs to decide what is unconstitutional. We have judges for that. And Chicago 675 says, when's the last time an Illinois proposed law made it to the U.S. Supreme Court? This ban is headed there for sure.
I guess we'll see.
We'll watch.
That's one of those we'll have to wait and see.